In 1822, the fields around a small Ohio settlement looked harmless, and at their far edge stood the Caldwell house, set square to the road like a vow. Neighbors called it sound, and they called its builder, Elias Caldwell, steady and decent, quick to help, slow to judge, firm in faith. He carried a mild voice and a tireless back, and his smile lingered as if waiting for others to arrive at a truth he already held. He was husband to Rachel and father to 5 girls, Anna, Ruth, Mary, Lydia, and Eliza, and to the town he looked like an answer to hardship. From the road, the house was plain. Inside it kept a different truth. Elias framed 2 stairways, though he showed one, set a hallway that bent before the back door so no guest could look straight through, and built matching closets where only one opened. Behind the others lay felt and boards fixed to swallow sound, and the walls were thickened with chaff and clay so a cry would die before it reached the yard. A narrow crawl ran behind the parlor with small peepholes. A loft ladder rose through a false shelf. A cellar door fell shut by a hidden weight and made no noise at all. He set the kitchen window to mirror the yard and pulled the bell from the gate, oiling the hinge until it moved like breath. He said a family needed order the way lungs needed air, and the house should teach without a switch. He set the clocks to different hours so each room had its own noon, and he trained the dog not to bark but to watch with still patience. He brought the girls into the rhythm of the rooms until their steps matched the grain of the boards. Shoes were placed each night on a carved line. A bench bore 5 shallow cuts, and each girl sat to her cut by age. He kept a ledger in the Bible drawer and wrote the hour each child rose, the work finished, the moment silence broke, and how long it took to mend. He tied entries to signs he trusted, moon phase, frost, first frog song, so the world itself seemed to bless his rule. 5 nails above the door held 5 dull ribbons. When a rule was kept, he turned a ribbon once. When it broke, he turned it back, and the turn felt heavier than any strap. In the barn, the stalls were numbered, but the 4th was missing, skipped as if it was a harm. The girls felt that gap like a cold patch on the floor. Rachel kept the kitchen and the sewing, her eyes often drifting to 5 young saplings set in a row. Elias said an orchard would steady the wind and sweeten the table. When neighbors came, he welcomed them only to the front room, poured coffee, praised the girls' stitches, and sent them back to work with a fondness that looked earned. His ease made the boundary feel like kindness, and good people do not press past kindness. He carried kindling to widows, set hinges without pay, comforted infants when mothers were worn thin, and once shared seed after frost took a field. When fever came, he cut linen for bandages and sang a soft hymn. He never spoke ill, and he never raised his voice. People said the Lord had given him a temper fit for fathers, and if his daughters were quiet, it proved that discipline could be grace. Inside, discipline was a clock that never stopped. He measured posture with a chalk line on the pantry door and smoothed the bench where knees should rest in prayer. He set a blank book on the table so restless eyes had a place to land. He filled wall gaps with pitch so voices would not travel. He layered straw in the walls and wet it with brine so heat would hold. And he smiled when the rooms kept stillness on command. He believed goodness was a craft, and the heart was wood. A sharp, steady blade could shave it true. He believed he was kind. The daughters believed survival came from reading his face before he knew he was being read. They set cups down so the wood would not ring, climbed without sound, and counted breaths to the slow swing of the kitchen door. They carried their names like candles in a draught and guarded the flame by habit. Near the cellar, shallow tallies rose to a child's shoulder. The girls traced them when sweeping the way a person touches a scar without meaning to. The settlement moved around the Caldwell place like water around a stone, steady and forgiving. Men traded tools with Elias and took his advice. Women praised Rachel's bread and envied her neat house. Children stepped off the path to stare, then ran laughing when the dog only watched. It was a home that promised safety, and that promise was its skin. If a traveler had lingered in the bent hallway, he would have felt the slight slope underfoot and thought the builder meant only to turn bad luck aside. If he had sat in the parlor to hear one clock strike while the kitchen held another hour, he would have shrugged and been grateful for warmth. If he had watched the girls lay their shoes on the carved line with quiet pride, he would have admired such tidy training and believed in love. But only Elias stood in every room and knew how the house held breath and let it go when he wished. At dusk he made a round with the stub of candle and touched each latch with 2 fingers. The rooms leaned toward his hand as if a bell were calling them to stillness. After the candle died, the ledger found his touch, and the neat lines closed the day like a lid. Outside, the fields went dark and the saplings drew straighter, measured against the night sky. Inside, 5 girls lay quiet and waited for sleep the way soldiers wait for orders, and their father stood in the doorway smiling longer than a smile should last, content that order had been kept and that tomorrow the house would teach again. What comes next begins with a lesson about silence and how to prove it. In the back field, the 5 saplings stood in a line, thin but stubborn against weather. He liked that kind of line, a rule planted and expected to grow straight. By habit, he timed the space between a dropped pin and its rest and called it peace. Soon he would ask the house to hold more than peace. Elias Caldwell lived inside a mask that the town never thought to question. To his neighbors, he was the man who lifted a fallen ox from the mud, who patched fences in the rain, who carried a sack of flour to a widow's door when her own millstone broke. They saw him bend in prayer with his hat pressed to his chest, his baritone voice rising steady and tender through the hymns, and they believed the voice revealed his soul. He smiled at them too long, holding their eyes with a warmth that seemed carved from kindness, and they turned from him comforted, never knowing that the smile was a door he had locked from the inside. Within his house, the same smile hung in the air like a lantern that burned too bright and scorched everything beneath it. He had built a faith that was less about God and more about control, a faith that demanded his daughters mirror the purity he imagined heaven required. He believed perfection was not a blessing but a craft, and he was the craftsman. Every gesture, every word, every flicker of hesitation in their eyes became material for his work. When one faltered in posture during evening prayers, he marked it in the ledger as if recording a debt. When another let her hand tremble as she stitched, he treated it as evidence of a stain on her soul. He did not punish them in the open because punishment suggested anger, and anger was base. Instead, he performed what he called corrections, and corrections were sacred trials, experiments designed to bend a child into the image he believed was hidden inside her. The corrections began small, almost invisible. He measured their silences and forced them to repeat the psalms until their voices cracked. He tied their fingers with twine and left them bound until they learned to stitch without error, saying that hands should serve without complaint. When one dropped a spoon during supper, he made her kneel in the pantry on scattered kernels of corn until the skin broke and the sting taught her to treat silence as holy. These were not acts of rage, but steps in a ritual that Elias believed he alone understood. In his mind, the suffering was not cruelty. It was devotion pressed into flesh. The rituals deepened as time passed. He began to speak of purity not as innocence, but as a vessel that had to be carved. He stripped their beds of blankets on cold nights and told them the body must learn to rely on spirit alone. He pressed coins against their eyelids while they prayed in the dark, whispering that only those who could keep still under weight would see the truth when the coins were removed. He built narrow boxes not to imprison but to confine, to teach the meaning of limits. He left them inside until they no longer strained against the walls, until their breathing slowed into the rhythm of surrender. Then he would open the door and smile, praising them for having learned. He told himself these were lessons, but they were more than that. They were rehearsals of control, each one drawing him closer to a line that no man should ever approach. He began to see failure not as a weakness to correct, but as an invitation to invent. Each lapse in obedience was an opportunity to create a new design, a new way to test the body until the soul broke free of what he called impurity. His cruelty was methodical, yet in his mind it was not cruelty at all. He believed he was saving them, shaping them, perfecting them in ways that the community outside his walls could never understand. The neighbors saw none of this. They saw the man who stayed after service to clean the churchyard, who spoke gently to children and blessed them with the weight of his hand. They saw the daughters walking 2 steps behind him with lowered heads and thought it was modesty, not fear. They heard his hymns through the open window at dusk and believed the family's silence afterward was peace. The truth was that silence came from dread, from the knowledge that the slightest misstep would bring another correction. Inside the house, the girls began to read his smile like scripture. They could tell by the way it lingered whether he had already decided who would be corrected that night. They learned to move quietly, to make their hands steady, to lower their eyes before his gaze demanded it. They carried fear in their stomachs like stones. Fear not of punishment, but of the strange, unspoken experiments that awaited them in the hidden corners of the house. His smile was never rage. Rage they could have understood. His smile was patience, and patience meant he had already imagined what would come next. Each correction left no visible wound that a neighbor might notice. Instead, it left an imprint inside them, a hollowing of spirit, a tightening of the chest that told them their bodies no longer belonged to themselves. They belonged to his vision of purity, to the silent ledger, to the twisted logic that disguised itself as devotion. Elias Caldwell walked the fields by day as a man of faith and goodwill, but by night he retreated into the ritual of shaping souls through suffering. His daughters lived in the space between those 2 faces, and every day the space grew smaller, pressing them into corners of silence until they no longer knew which face was real. To the community, Elias Caldwell was the man who smiled too long, the man whose voice filled the chapel with grace. To his daughters, that same smile was the shadow of a cage, and they knew that sooner or later the cage would close fully around one of them. And when it did, it would not be called punishment. It would be called salvation, carved into them by a hand that believed it was serving God. What came next was not a lesson in silence, but the first fall, and it would mark the beginning of something far darker than correction. The Caldwell daughters learned early that silence was not just expected but demanded, and in their father's house it became the difference between safety and ruin. Elias believed that words carried infection, that idle chatter bred weakness, and that the voice, if left unchecked, could betray the soul. To him, silence was not absence but proof of purity, a test of discipline that no one outside his house could ever understand. He built his proof into wood and earth, crafting a cellar beneath the floorboards that no neighbor ever saw. He lined its walls with boards packed with husks and clay, materials that swallowed echoes until a scream shrank to nothing before it could rise. The place was not for storage but for lessons, and he named it in his ledger as the Chamber of Stillness, though to his daughters it became something closer to a tomb. When voices displeased him, when a laugh broke too freely, when a hymn trembled off key, or when a whispered word slipped where none should, Elias brought them down into that cellar. He carried a lantern but kept its light dim as if light itself was undeserved. The girls were led inside barefoot so the cold earth would remind them of their place. He explained to them that silence was not punishment but devotion, that the soul must learn to bow before the stillness God himself kept. To enforce this, he devised methods that blurred the line between ritual and torture, claiming each as a sacred act. One of his cruelties was suspension by the hair. He fitted iron hooks into the ceiling beam and looped strands of their hair with rough twine, tugging until their bodies lifted just enough to stretch the scalp. He left them there, feet grazing the earth, blood pounding in their heads, forcing them to remain wordless. Any cry of pain tightened the knots further, and only when they endured in silence did he cut them loose. He told them afterward that a true spirit should suffer without sound, and if they felt the ache long after, it was proof that their pride was being pulled out by the root. At other times he plunged them into complete darkness with no sense of hours passing. He would lock them in the cellar for days, extinguishing every flame and sealing cracks until even the outline of their hands disappeared. The girls learned to count their breaths to keep from vanishing inside their own minds, but the cellar betrayed them. He had fitted boards along the walls to absorb every echo so their voices, even if they dared whisper, died instantly. They would cry out just to test if they were still real, but the silence after their own words left them trembling, unsure if they had ever spoken at all. He returned when he chose, opening the door suddenly with his long smile, and asked them what they had learned. If they hesitated to answer, he called the lesson incomplete and sent them back into the void. But his most chilling design was the narrow wooden boxes shaped to hold a child's body without space to move. He laid them inside with their arms pinned at their sides, the lid nailed shut so no light could seep through. Above each box he hung a vessel that dripped water at steady intervals, each drop landing on the wood with hollow rhythm. The sound did not comfort them, it mocked them, tick by tick, as if time itself had been turned into a weapon. Hours blended into days, and the endless dripping burrowed into their minds until it was no longer water but a clock that would never stop. When he finally opened the boxes, they emerged pale and shaking, unsure of whether minutes or lifetimes had passed. He praised their silence, noting in his ledger that their souls had been scrubbed of noise. Over time, the daughters stopped speaking freely even when they were allowed above. Words became dangerous, each syllable a step closer to the cellar. They communicated in glances, in the way a hand lingered on a chair, in breaths held or released at certain moments. Their voices faded until even when safe they sounded like echoes of themselves. The lessons worked as Elias intended. He erased not just their words, but their sense of self, molding them into shadows that moved only when guided. Neighbors who visited heard nothing unusual. They praised the girls' obedience, remarking how rare it was for children to be so quiet and composed. To Elias, their admiration was confirmation that his lessons were righteous. To the girls, it was proof that no one outside would ever see the truth. Silence was survival, and survival meant enduring whatever form his rituals took next. Above the ground, the orchard grew, saplings stiff against the wind, lined in perfect order as Elias preferred. Below, in the chamber of stillness, his daughters learned to surrender their voices piece by piece. Each lesson hollowed them further until silence was no longer a trial but their only way of being. It was then that Elias began to see which of them had weakened first, which spirit he judged as too fragile to be perfected. In his ledger he marked a note beside Anna's name, a mark not for correction but for something final. Anna Caldwell was 17 when her father decided that her spirit had soured. She had grown tall, her frame bending into womanhood, and with it came small signs of independence, An extra glance toward the window when she should have been bent to her sewing. A pause in prayer that lasted a breath too long. A tremor of defiance when his smile demanded perfect stillness. To Elias, these were not the natural stirrings of a young woman, but proof of rebellion. In his mind, rebellion was rot, and rot spread unless it was carved out. He told himself that Anna carried a disease of the soul, and it was his duty as father and shepherd to heal her through discipline. Healing, to Elias, meant invention. He prepared his method with the same calm patience he used in the fields. He mixed plaster in a basin, grinding it until the dust filled the air like smoke, then poured water until the pale substance thickened to a paste. He called it the stone of purity, a tool meant to harden weakness into permanence. He set Anna in a chair in the cellar, her sisters watching with silent eyes, and dipped her arms into the mixture. He layered it until the weight encased her from fingertips to shoulder, the plaster drying heavy and suffocating around her skin. She whimpered once when the material heated as it hardened, but Elias only placed a hand on her head and told her to be still, for pain was the spirit's cleansing fire. As the days passed, the plaster cracked and pressed into her skin. Beneath the shell, her flesh swelled, blood pooling where it could not flow, the pressure blooming into infection. The smell came first, sharp and sour, seeping from beneath the hardened surface. Her body shivered with fever, her eyes glassy, but Elias watched with an almost tender patience. He told the others that Anna was being purified, that her silence proved she was nearing God. When she wept in the night, he told them those were not tears of suffering, but of surrender. He wrote each stage in his ledger with neat lines, marking the lesson as progress, not decay. The sisters sat at their work during the day, with ears straining for Anna's breathing below, each ragged gasp reminding them what defiance cost. Their mother Rachel carried food to the cellar but found it untouched, Anna's fingers too swollen and stiff to grasp even a crust of bread. Elias would not permit her release, saying to interfere was to fight God's will. He spoke of patience, of the stone hardening sin into something that could finally be broken away. In truth, the stone only devoured her, sealing infection against her skin until her body surrendered. When the end came, it was quiet. Anna's chest stilled in the night, and the plaster arms that had bound her lay cold against her side. Elias stood over her body at dawn, the same smile stretching too long, and told Rachel and the girls that God had chosen to take Anna because her spirit had not been pure enough to endure. He lifted her with effort, the weight of the casts turning her into something more object than child, and carried her to the orchard where 5 saplings swayed in the breeze. He dug a shallow grave near the first tree, pressing her body into the soil as if planting another root. The others stood in silence, their throats tight, unable to weep in front of him. He told them that Anna's fall was a lesson, a warning that disobedience would always bring death. He did not let them mourn. Instead, he demanded they give thanks for God's justice. He pressed their hands to the earth above Anna's grave and told them to pray that no more rebellion would grow among them. Each girl bowed, trembling, whispering prayers they did not believe, but they spoke them with mouths dry from fear. To them, grief had become a forbidden thing. To Elias, grief was a weakness that undermined his authority, so he shaped it into fear, turning sorrow into obedience. From that day forward, the orchard held a shadow. Each time the wind shook the young branches, the sisters thought of Anna's body beneath the soil. Each time they passed the grave, they felt the weight of the plaster on their own arms, heavy even in memory. Elias walked past it daily without pause, his eyes already fixed on the next lesson, the next correction that would prove his daughter's purity. He believed Anna's death had not been a failure but a triumph, the first sacrifice in his silent war against disobedience. and though the grave was shallow, the fear it birthed was deep, sinking into the marrow of every child left alive in that house. Anna was gone, but the stone of purity remained in Elias's mind as proof of his power. It was not grief he carried with him after her burial, but a calm certainty that the others, too, could be tested in their own way. In his eyes, Anna's end had shown him a path, and he intended to walk it without hesitation. The orchard had gained its first grave, and the soil had learned to keep secrets. Soon, it would not be the last. Ruth Caldwell was 13 when her father fixed his gaze on her. She was smaller than Anna had been, gentler in her movements, with a voice that sometimes rose soft in the fields when she thought no one listened. That voice unsettled Elias. To him, sound was dangerous, a doorway for sin. He believed Anna's rebellion had begun with tone, hesitation in hymns, whispers against his command. And now he watched Ruth's mouth as though every word carried a threat. Where silence had been Anna's lesson, sound would be Ruth's. He told himself he was not punishing her, but harvesting the truth within her. A spirit, he claimed, must be winnowed like grain, its noise stripped away until only purity remained. He built the device in the barn, crafting it from rough wood and scraps of metal. It was a collar, wide and heavy, fastened at the back so she could not remove it. From the rim he hung a dozen small bells, the kind used on livestock, so that each step, each tilt of her head, each movement of breath stirred a chiming chorus. He locked it around Ruth's neck and ordered her to move through the day as she always did, sweeping floors, fetching water, kneeling at prayer. The bells answered every motion, no matter how slight, a constant reminder of her body's betrayal. By nightfall her shoulders shook, her legs weak from the strain of holding still, tears cutting lines down her dirt-streaked face. Every tremor of exhaustion betrayed her with another ring, and Elias smiled at the music as though it confirmed his righteousness. For days she endured the collar, her exhaustion deepening, sleep broken by the faint sound of her own shifting body. When she begged with her eyes for release, Elias praised her endurance and told the others this was the sound of sin being cast out. Rachel, her mother, carried bowls of broth to the table, but Ruth could not bring the spoon to her lips without the bells chiming. Her sisters watched with wide, silent eyes, knowing any attempt to comfort her would only invite the collar upon themselves. Each ring of the bells became part of the house's air, echoing in their dreams even when the device rested on the peg by Elias's chair. When Ruth's body began to fail under the weight of exhaustion, Elias devised a harsher lesson. He removed the bells and replaced them with fine wires stretched taut across the wooden rim, positioned against her throat. The wires vibrated with each word, each hum of breath turning her voice into a strained instrument. He called it her hymn of humility, demanding she sing psalms while the wires cut and bruised. Her voice cracked into raw gasps, the vibrations tearing at her flesh until every sound she made was laced with pain. To him this was proof of pride being broken, the body yielding its will to his design. He recorded in his ledger that Ruth had become a living instrument, a vessel remade for holiness. The lesson was relentless. He forced her to sing at dawn, her throat burning as the wires bit deeper. When she faltered, he struck the side of the collar to make the wires hum, telling her this was her true voice, the voice of humility learned through suffering. Ruth staggered under the strain, the sound of her own voice turned against her. By the third day, her breath came in short, jagged bursts. She collapsed in the cellar, her body unable to carry the weight of his invention. Elias stood over her as she twitched in silence, and when her chest stilled, he declared to the family that Ruth had drowned in her own pride. He said her voice had been too heavy with sin to be saved, and so God had taken her. The others stood frozen, their grief sealed behind lips that dared not open. Rachel wept in private, but when Elias found her tears, he told her that sorrow for sin was disobedience to God. He carried Ruth's body to the orchard, digging another shallow grave beside Anna's, pressing the soil flat as though sealing a seed. He told the sisters that the earth would keep the lesson, that the orchard would grow strong because sacrifice had been planted beneath it. To them, the orchard became a place of fear, each tree a marker of suffering they could not escape. When the neighbors asked about Ruth's sudden death, Elias explained it with calm sorrow. He told them she had been struck by fever of the throat, that her voice had given out as if God himself had stilled it. The local minister, blind to any doubt, placed a hand on Elias's shoulder and told him to stay strong in his faith. At Ruth's burial, he led a hymn, his baritone rising rich against the congregation's chorus, and no one thought to question why 2 daughters had already gone into the ground within the year. Elias lowered his head as if in grief, but behind the mask his smile stretched again, long and patient, the smile of a man convinced his harvest was only beginning. In the orchard, 2 graves lay side by side, the soil above them bare, the saplings trembling in the wind. Inside the house, the air still carried the ghostly echo of bells, and each of the remaining daughters carried that sound inside their chests, knowing it could be their own before long. Mary Caldwell was 11, the most fragile of the sisters, her frame slight and her nature quiet. She had always clung to her mother's skirts, whispering prayers as if words themselves might shield her. But to Elias, her timidity was not innocence. It was a weakness, a flaw that needed to be hardened, reforged through trial. He had broken Anna with stone, silenced Ruth with sound, and now he turned to Mary with the certainty of a craftsman perfecting his methods. For her he chose fire, the oldest element, the purifier that devoured and left only what he called truth. He named it the trial of devotion, a test to see whether her breath would rise to God or falter under flame. He constructed the chamber in secret, a small room of brick at the far end of the cellar. Its walls held heat and its door sealed tight against air. Inside he placed shallow bowls filled with glowing coals, their smoke creeping upward in invisible threads. The chamber was not meant to burn her outright, but to smother her, to starve her body of the very breath that proved her alive. He believed that breath was pride, that clinging to it was selfishness, and surrendering it was proof of holiness. When he led Mary down the narrow steps, her small hands shook, her eyes darting to her sisters who stood frozen above. She did not resist. Resistance had been broken from all of them. She walked as if led to prayer, though her chest already trembled with fear. Elias shut the heavy door and slid the iron latch into place. From a slit in the wall he watched, the dim light of his lantern falling across her face as the smoke thickened. At first she tried to kneel and pray, mouthing words he could not hear, her lips trembling with each whispered plea. But the air grew thin, her body swaying as her lungs pulled harder. She pressed her hands to her chest. As though she could hold the breath inside, he wrote later in his ledger that she faltered at this stage, that her devotion had not yet been proven. He smiled as he watched her stumble, her small frame collapsing near the glowing coals. To him, her weakness was not tragedy. It was evidence that the ritual was needed. Her breaths turned into gasps, ragged and sharp. Each one fed her less, her eyes wide with panic as she clawed at the air. The coals glowed brighter against her pallor, the chamber tightening around her until the room itself seemed to press against her lungs. She fell to her knees, her lips darkening, her fingers twitching against the cold floor. Elias pressed his face close to the slit, studying the final tremors as if recording an experiment. When at last her chest ceased its struggle, when silence overtook her, he closed his eyes in satisfaction. He told himself that her spirit had been released through fire, purified at last, no longer bound to the frail flesh that had failed him. When he pulled her body from the chamber, it was limp and pale, her skin damp with the heat of smoke. He carried her upstairs in his arms, his expression solemn but not grieving, as if performing a sacred duty. Rachel sobbed quietly in the corner, her hands clutching at her apron, but Elias silenced her with a glance. He told the others this was God's will, that Mary had passed her trial and been judged unworthy. Then, in a ritual more chilling than the death itself, he set to work destroying the evidence of her body. He burned her remains in the stove, grinding what was left into ash. He mixed the ash into flour and water, kneading it into bread, baking it until the smell filled the house. When he placed the bread on the table, the sisters stared at it in horror, but his smile demanded obedience. He broke the loaf with his own hands, serving it as though it were communion, his voice calm as he told them to eat. To refuse was to question God, and questioning meant punishment. One by one they lifted the bread to their lips, the taste heavy and strange, their throats closing as they swallowed. Rachel ate too, her tears silent, her body trembling under his gaze. Elias believed he had bound them together through this act, that by consuming Mary they carried her devotion inside them. In truth, he had broken them further, turning every meal into a reminder that obedience was survival. Afterward, the house grew quieter still. The girls no longer dared whisper, even in secret. Their fear deepened by the knowledge that their own bodies could be turned into lessons, their own deaths transformed into ritual. Each task they performed was done with trembling care, each hymn sung with voices low and steady lest they attract their father's attention. Elias walked among them as though shepherd and priest, his smile stretched with the certainty of his righteousness. He wrote in his ledger that the trial of devotion had been successful, that the family was more united than before. To him, Mary's ashes had been a blessing. To the others, they were a curse they could never escape. In the orchard, another grave was dug, shallow and hurried, the soil pressed flat beneath the swaying branches. 3 daughters now lay beneath the earth, their names carved only in the silence of those who still lived. Elias passed the graves each morning with calm eyes, his mind already turning toward the next lesson, the next sacrifice he believed necessary. And the daughters who remained knew that their father's hunger was not yet sated. That fire and breath were only one stage in his unending ritual of control. Lydia Caldwell was 14 when her father turned his eyes upon her. By then, 3 of her sisters were gone, their graves lined like warnings in the orchard. Lydia was sharper than the others had been, more watchful, her silence edged with awareness rather than surrender. She had learned to study Elias's movements, to anticipate when his smile stretched too long, when his voice carried a certain weight that meant danger. That intelligence unsettled him. He told himself it was pride disguised as wit, that she harbored impurities deeper than her sisters, hidden behind a mask of quiet obedience. He believed she had to be broken in a way that touched not only her body but her very sense of self. For Lydia, he built the mirror room. The room was small, paneled with sheets of polished tin that caught and warped every reflection. The metal shimmered with a dull, distorted gleam, turning Lydia's image into something grotesque and unfamiliar no matter where she looked. One wall stretched her limbs into spindles, another bent her head wide and flat, another shrank her form into something hunched and pitiful. Elias led her inside, locked the door, and left her standing in the dim light with nothing but her endless twisted reflections staring back. He starved her there, sliding only thin crusts of bread under the door, leaving her to lick moisture from the damp corners. Hunger gnawed at her body, but it was the mirrors that hollowed her faster. Through narrow cracks, Elias whispered, his voice low and patient, never shouting. He told her she was unclean, that every warped reflection showed the truth of her soul. He said she was undeserving of light, that even her sisters had been closer to purity than she. Each word seeped into her like poison, made heavier by the endless images pressing in on all sides. Whenever she tried to close her eyes, his whispers filled the silence. Whenever she dared to lift her head, she met a dozen twisted versions of herself staring back with contempt. Days passed this way, her body weakening, her spirit fraying. The girl who had once studied him with quiet defiance began to crumble. When she cried, her reflection multiplied the tears until it seemed 100 Lydias wept back at her. When she crouched to hide from the images, her body bent across the metal walls in grotesque shapes, mocking her. She began to believe what he told her, that she was distorted inside as well as out, that impurity lived in her flesh and her very breath. Her hunger blurred her vision, and soon she could not tell if the whispers were real or if the mirrors themselves had learned to speak. The room consumed her piece by piece, her sense of self dissolving in the endless warped light. At last, Elias decided she had broken enough. He entered the room with scissors and shears, forcing her to her knees. He shaved her head, each lock of hair falling like pieces of the girl she once had been. He told her she had no right to carry beauty when her soul was soiled. He gathered the hair and carried it away, leaving her scalp raw and stinging in the dim light. Later, in the stillness of night, he stitched the strands into a crude doll, shaping it with thread and straw, binding it into a twisted likeness of her. He called it her shadow self, the part of her that must be buried to protect the rest. But Elias never intended to protect. He had already marked her as the fourth to fall. When her body weakened beyond recovery, her eyes sunken and her lips cracked from thirst, he lifted her from the mirror room and placed her inside a narrow wooden coffin. He tucked the hair doll against her chest, fastening it with twine so it would not slip from her grasp. To him, the doll symbolized the impurity that had ruined her, the shadow that would be buried with her so that the orchard could grow stronger. To her sisters, watching with hollow stares, it was a sight too terrible to speak of. A final act that robbed Lydia not only of life, but of dignity. He sealed the coffin and carried it to the orchard, his neighbors watching from afar. To them he looked like a grieving father once again burdened with loss. His posture was heavy, his steps slow, his face carved in sorrow. They pitied him, whispering of his misfortune, of how no man should be asked to bury 4 daughters in such a short span. None questioned the coffins or the graves, none looked close enough to see the strange stitching of hair within. They saw only the surface, and Elias knew how to hold a mask long enough for them to turn away. The soil closed over Lydia, another mound in the orchard row. Elias stood above it with folded hands, whispering a prayer for the ears of others, but smiling inwardly at the completion of another ritual. To him, the orchard was ripening, each grave a seed planted in the name of purity. To the daughters who remained, the orchard had become a map of their own fate, each mound a marker showing how close their turn had come. Lydia's absence was another hollow carved in their hearts, another reminder that no defiance, no intelligence, no silence could save them. And in Elias's ledger, Lydia's name was marked with a final line. He noted that her reflection had revealed the corruption of her spirit, that she had surrendered to her own unworthiness, and that her burial with the doll ensured impurity would not rise again. He closed the book with steady hands, certain of his purpose, already turning in his mind to the youngest, Eliza, the last songbird left to silence. Eliza Caldwell was the youngest, barely 9, the last child left in a house where 4 graves already waited in the orchard. She was small, delicate, and carried a voice that sometimes lifted in fragile hymns when she thought no one listened. To Elias, that voice became an obsession. He named her the songbird of heaven. A child whose purity could be proven only through sound offered again and again until it broke. Where Anna had been tested by stone, Ruth by bells, Mary by fire, and Lydia by mirrors, Eliza would be tested by her voice, her breath, the very essence of her being. He told himself this trial would be the most sacred, that through her he would perfect the ritual that had claimed her sisters. He built the device with steady hands, shaping it from thin wooden slats. It resembled a cage, tall and narrow, just wide enough for Eliza to stand within. Once locked inside, she could not sit or kneel, her body pressed upright, her small back aching against the bars. Elias demanded she sing, filling the air with hymns from dawn until her throat strained. Each note echoed in the chamber, bouncing back at her until the sound became suffocating. She sang until her voice cracked, until her lips trembled with exhaustion, but still he urged her onward, standing outside the slats with his long smile, calling her song a prayer that reached heaven. Days passed this way, her body weakening, her song growing hoarse. She begged with her eyes for rest, but he silenced her with a raised hand. Every falter was noted in his ledger, every crack in her voice marked as evidence of impurity. He told himself that the voice was not hers, but God's, and it must be preserved no matter the cost. When her strength failed completely, when her small body sagged against the slats and her voice fell into silence, he took the ritual further. He cut reeds from the riverbank, sharpening them into slender points, and forced them down her throat, wedging them deep into the raw flesh. He told the others it was to preserve her song, to keep her voice from leaving even as her body failed. The reeds tore at her insides, filling her mouth with the taste of iron, her eyes wide with terror as she choked on her father's invention. The end came slowly, each breath shallow and broken, her body racked with pain as he demanded one final hymn. What escaped her was no longer a song, but a rasping cry that barely reached his ears. Yet he leaned close, smiling as though listening to angels, convinced that her suffering had carried her spirit into heaven. When her body stilled at last, her small hands gripping the slats until they slackened, Elias unlocked the cage with the calm of a man completing holy work. He laid her down gently as though she were precious even in death, and told the others she had been too pure for this world. Rachel collapsed in grief, her sobs echoing through the silent house, but Elias did not comfort her. He told her to be strong, to see God's hand in the sacrifice. The sisters who remained alive no longer existed. There were none left. He had taken them all one by one, each trial etched in his ledger, each death explained away with the same twisted calm. But with Eliza gone, the illusion of a household still standing finally fractured. The walls seemed too still, the air too heavy, the silence no longer obedience but absence. Yet Elias pressed forward, arranging for what he called their final blessing. He ordered 5 coffins, small and plain, and dug the earth in the orchard where the saplings now reached higher, their roots deepening into soil already heavy with secrets. He buried Anna, Ruth, Mary, Lydia, and Eliza together, aligned in a perfect row, their graves mirroring the orchard's order. To the neighbors, it was a scene of unbearable tragedy, a father laying all 5 daughters to rest on the same day. They gathered in pity, believing misfortune had cursed his house. Elias stood before them with a bowed head and a voice steady in prayer, his long smile hidden beneath grief's mask. No one questioned. No one asked why 5 children could die under one roof in so short a time. The minister blessed him for his strength, the town whispered prayers for his endurance, and the orchard became a monument to sorrow that none dared disturb. But inside the ground lay more than sorrow. Each coffin carried not only a child's body, but a ritual completed, a lesson Elias had carved into flesh and breath. In his mind, the row of graves was not tragedy but triumph, a harvest planted in perfect order. He believed he had proven his devotion through them, that their silence, their songs, their pain had been offerings God could not ignore. As the last shovelful of dirt was pressed flat, he lifted his head to the sky, convinced that heaven itself had turned its gaze upon him. The neighbors drifted away, leaving him alone among the graves. The orchard swayed gently in the wind, the saplings moving like mourners, and Elias smiled at the sight. To him, the orchard was not filled with loss, but with life, its roots drinking deep from the bodies beneath. He carried his ledger back inside, closed its cover with care, and sat in the darkened house where silence now reigned. He believed his work complete, that he had given all that was asked of him. Yet in the silence, something lingered. The faint echo of Eliza's broken song caught between the slats of a cage that would never be heard again. The township of 1822 whispered with unease, though no one dared to speak too loud. 5 daughters gone within the space of months, laid in the ground together as if death itself had chosen the Caldwell orchard for its dwelling. Neighbors shook their heads in pity, calling it misfortune, a curse, the hand of God testing a devout man. They gathered at each burial, their faces soft with sorrow, their words heavy with sympathy, never once pressing too close to the truth. Elias bowed his head, his baritone hymns rising steady over the graves, and to their ears he sounded like a father broken by grief, yet held upright by faith. His smile, when it appeared, was mistaken for endurance, a light carried through shadow. Only a few felt something cold move beneath that mask. The local doctor, a man seasoned by years of tending wounds and sickness, was one of them. He had seen Anna's arm stiffened unnaturally, the skin discolored as if bound too long. He had seen Ruth's throat bruised in places no fever could cause. Mary's lungs bore smoke, not infection. Lydia's scalp was raw, her head shorn with purpose, not illness. And Eliza's mouth carried wounds that did not come from any natural end. He noted these things quietly, his concern growing heavier with each child lowered into the earth. Yet when he raised his observations, Elias's voice cut through with calm precision. He spoke of God's mysterious will, of sin punished in secret ways, of the dangers of questioning divine judgment. Behind his words was something sharper, a threat, soft, yet unmistakable. The doctor withdrew into silence, his suspicions locked away where no one would hear. Still, the unease seeped into the community like rot under a door. Children stopped playing near the Caldwell fields, their laughter turning to whispers when they passed the orchard row. They swore they could hear faint cries in the wind, or the chiming of bells when no one moved. Mothers pulled their little ones close, crossing themselves if Elias's shadow touched the path beside them. Fathers greeted him stiffly, their eyes lowering, unwilling to meet the smile that lingered too long. No one accused him, but no one trusted him either. The family became a wound in the center of the township, covered with cloth so it would not fester in sight, yet never healing. Rachel Caldwell walked the edges of that wound in silence, her body a shell of exhaustion and fear. Neighbors pitied her, believing grief had hollowed her, never suspecting she carried truths too dreadful to speak. She obeyed Elias outwardly, bowing her head at his side, tending to his table, nodding at his words. But in private, her spirit cracked. She whispered fragments in the dark, half confessions, half prayers. Her mind too broken to hold the weight of what she had witnessed. She spoke of plaster and bells, of fire and mirrors, of a cage that turned a child's hymn into a final cry. Yet she never told the whole, her fear binding her even after the last coffin had closed. Years passed, the orchard growing taller, the graves blending into the land. Elias's reputation lingered, respected by some, feared by others, his ledger kept hidden as a testament to his twisted devotion. Only later, when Rachel neared her own death, did pieces of the truth escape her lips. She confessed in fragments, trembling as though Elias still listened. She spoke of experiments called lessons, of rituals masked as salvation, of children remade until they could no longer endure. The words were scattered, incomplete, but they carried enough weight to shift the air of silence. What the community had whispered as rumor began to harden into suspicion. The image of Elias as a suffering father cracked, revealing the shadow that had always stood beneath his smile. By then it was too late for the 5 girls whose names lived only in shallow graves. The orchard still stood, the trees full with fruit, their roots fattened on soil that had swallowed innocence. The community carried its unease forward, a quiet acknowledgement that evil had lived among them, disguised as faith and family. Children were warned never to linger near houses where too much silence lived. Women crossed themselves in the shadows, and men avoided those whose smiles lingered longer than they should. The story of the Caldwells began to spread, never fully told but never entirely buried either. And beneath it all remained the truth that had haunted the house from the beginning. Evil does not always shout. Sometimes it sings hymns with a warm baritone, carries bread to a neighbor, bows its head in prayer. Sometimes it wears the face of a father, and only when the graves are full does the silence begin to speak. Decades passed, and the Caldwell farm fell into ruin. The house that once stood square against the field sagged inward, its timbers warped, its roof caved under years of rain and neglect. Weeds swallowed the orchard row where 5 shallow graves lay, their markers long since rotted away. Neighbors had moved on, generations shifting until the land itself was remembered only in whispers. Some said it was cursed, that the trees bore fruit with a bitter taste, that the soil beneath carried something unclean. Children dared one another to approach but never lingered long, as if the silence of the place still pressed too heavy on the chest. When the land was finally sold and plowed, the past surfaced like bones rising through thawed ground. Workers unearthed remnants of hidden chambers beneath the farmhouse, dark spaces lined with warped boards meant to swallow sound. In the dirt they found narrow wooden boxes, their insides scarred with nail scratches that told of frantic attempts to escape. Shackles were discovered in walls, iron bands rusted but still locked tight, proof that suffering had been bound into the structure itself. Each discovery painted the house not as a home but as a vessel of torment, built to conceal ritual cruelty behind the mask of family. The orchard graves, disturbed by the plow, revealed the bodies of 5 daughters buried in alignment, their fragile bones pressed against one another as though even in death they had been forced to obey his order. The revelation spread slowly, retold in hushed tones across counties. People came to the site quietly, not to speak but to stand in uneasy silence. Women pressed their palms to the earth above the graves as if offering comfort to children who had never known it. Men shook their heads at the thought that no one had seen through the mask of a man who sang hymns and carried himself as righteous. The farm became a place of pilgrimage, not marked by signs or monuments at first, but carried by story. A caution passed from mouth to ear, reminding each generation that evil does not always arrive in violence at the door, but sometimes grows quietly inside it. In time, these stories fed into something larger. Lawmakers, stirred by tragedies whispered across towns like this, began to debate the rights of children, the oversight of guardians, the ways a household could hide horrors until it was too late. Rules were shaped about welfare, about watching not just for hunger or neglect, but for signs that devotion itself could be twisted into harm. They did not name the Caldwells outright, but the shadow of that farm lingered in the ink of new laws, as if the graves of 5 sisters had been seeds from which protection slowly grew. And yet, even as society changed, the deeper question never left. How could a man who smiled so warmly, who helped mend fences, who sang hymns with such devotion, bury all 5 of his daughters on the same day, without suspicion tearing him apart? How could neighbors stand so near and see nothing? The answer was simple and terrifying. Because evil thrives in silence, and silence thrives where trust blinds the eye. Elias Caldwell had hidden behind kindness, had masked horror with piety, and the world around him had chosen to believe what was easiest to believe. The Caldwell orchard eventually rotted away, but the story remained, retold each time someone asked whether such a thing could happen again. It is tempting to think the past was darker than today, that society has grown too watchful, too advanced, to allow evil to root itself in plain sight. Yet history whispers caution. It reminds us that masks are still worn, that cruelty still learns to disguise itself as love, that the warmest smile can conceal the coldest intent. So the graves of the Caldwell daughters stand not only as a memory but as a warning. They ask a question that echoes louder with each generation. If a man could once hide such horror beneath the mask of devotion, what stops another from doing the same? And when it happens again, as history suggests it always will we hear the whispers in time, or will we once more mistake obedience and silence for peace?